Okay, everyone, I'm doing part two of the progressives. I just want to give you a taste of some of the progressive movements. It's really interesting. Some of the reforms, just kind of fall in a few different themes. There's a lot of political reforms, and these are really reforms that attempt to bring about greater access to democracy and greater democracy, greater participation. There will be a lot of limits to this. We see plenty of racism, segregation, in the time period of progressive reform. So we're not going to suggest like a civil rights movement in the progressive period. In a lot of ways, that does not happen, but there's some pushing in that direction. And we start to see some of the projects and issues that the populists had, called upon, like things like regulating the railroad or making sure that people have a minimum wage or whatever it might be. Those various things get some attention. So an example of this is Robert La Follette, who is a governor in the state of Wisconsin. So around the turn of the century, he does a couple of experimental things. And, what is kind of notable about this particular governor, he kind of uses his state as a lab for some democratic reform. And what works, he kind of sells, in a sense, not literally, but sells and kind of advocates other states to embrace. And things that don't necessarily work just kind of, don't get employed again. He does create a workers' compensation system, ultimately supports a minimum wage, railroad rate reform, so kind of keeping some check on corporations. And he ultimately tries a referendum, which is a tool that states use to bring about a public question onto a ballot. For example, the state of New Jersey, which uses a referendum, can sometimes put a public question on a ballot. So some years ago, the question related to minimum wage gradually increasing. That was a question, and New Jerseyans voted in favor of it. So the law definitely occurred. So it's a way of lawmaking that can be, very, very much kind of at the hands of the people. There's also some expertise that Robert La Follette brings into Wisconsin by collaborating with academics, at the university. So there's like some education and some, information that is kind of getting injected into policy decision making, and that becomes very notable. Okay, so it's not just political. This is supposed to stamp out, corruption and things like that. Some other broader political reforms, many of these are also at the state level. The secret ballot, we take it for granted that there's a secret ballot. When you go to vote, nobody else knows who you're voting for. In this time period, everybody knew who you were voting for. Paper was often color coded. So, if there was a political machine that was pressuring you to vote a certain way, it would be really difficult to vote in the opposing way, or you could, lose some sort of, economic incentives or whatever. So there was a lot of pressure for who you might vote for. The secret ballot becomes like a tool of greater democracy. Commissions and city managers propose new kind of models for local government. Instead of having just a single mayor who maybe is a political figure who is elected, who has a great deal of political power, maybe you could also have a city manager who might be hired as an expert to organize and run a city, might be on salary and might not be elected. So, for example, in the state of New Jersey, there are 4 different types of governments that cities and municipalities can have, and the single mayor council model is only one of 4. Some communities do have a commission, which is like a group of people who share expertise in different issues, right? So kind of bringing some of that expertise into the political process. The initiative is a way that the public can gain signatures about an issue that they have concern about, and then with enough signatures you can bring it to your state government's attention, for example, and with a certain number of signatures you can kind of petition to get your issue discussed in state government. A referendum is that public question that gets placed on ballots, and direct primaries and recalls The recall is a way of being able to remove where the people get to decide to remove an elected official. And direct primaries would enable the public to select political candidates, for a general election rather than, say, a state government. So, these are all tools that are giving the individual in democracy. And of course, we're still in a place in the early 1900s where not everybody is voting. There's a good number of people who are fighting to be considered American and fighting to be considered American citizens and so on. So there's a lot of people who are outside of the vote, even if the Constitution protects them, like Black men in the South, who might be constitutionally able to vote, but are still facing, literacy tests or grandfather clauses or whatever else might be happening in a segregated South at this time. We also have quite a few progressive projects that really center around anti-alcohol. And so some of this kind of comes from some earlier reforms. There had long been a women's Christians temperance union. So alcohol was always a space where there were female reformers, in particular, Christian reformers who were seeking kind of an end to alcohol, kind of looking at alcohol as something that was generally immoral or taboo. In cities, the Anti-Saloon League grew, and these particular organizations merged to create a massive push against alcohol. So with urbanization, larger numbers of people in cities, growth of saloons, there becomes this sense that alcohol is breaking up families or breaking up marriages or creating a lot of, kind of moral, issues. And so some of progressive reform kind of weighs into this, category of like some paternalism where there is a way of kind of cleaning up society, and that begs a whole bunch of assumptions, but we do see the 18th Amendment pass in Congress in 1917, which is the same year the U.S. gets involved in World War I. And, one of the arguments for that timing is that, grain needs to be preserved for the war, so it can't be used for alcohol. But largely, this is a moral crusade, and there's a great deal of protests that organizations make that are anti-alcohol. The 18th Amendment is around for some time, especially throughout the 1920s, although it will be the only amendment that really gets repealed. The 21st Amendment repeals the 18th Amendment. You can see some of these posters here, like on the left, the Titanic carried down 1503, 1,503 people. Drink carries off 1,503 men and women every 8 days in the year. No man need die of alcohol-caused disease. So, ways in which today we might, kind of ring the alarm bell on like smartphones or, vaping or whatever it is, in this time period, alcohol is getting a great deal of attention. Not to say that there wasn't any alcohol drinking. The United States is highly known for high levels of alcohol consumption. A lot of this in the time period of the progressive reform, does get attached, often unfairly, to immigrant groups. But, probably the peak time for alcohol consumption in the United States is probably more around the 1820s and 1830s, where it was often used by some, because the water wasn't always so great. But in any case, it could be relatively, high. And on the right, we see, this is 36 states can stop this by constitutional amendment, right? And the saloon is figured in the political cartoon, and the baby, inherited appetite for liquor. And, this is, it says on the bottom, putting the mortgage on the cradle. So, kind of this idea that, there is a, something that, is, we're just passing this along. Okay. And this is, kind of we're passing this on to the next generation, these costs of alcohol. The progressives also become very focused on labor reform. And in particular, we saw a lot of union activity during the Gilded Age. What becomes notable in the time period of the progressives, this is a huge, kind of characteristic of progressive reform, is this push to use the government as a regulator for labor, so that things get written into the laws and that there become, advocates for labor in, policy making circles. One big way in which this happens is after a great deal of, really atrocious, factory incidents. And probably the most notable is the Triangle Factory fire, which happens in 1911. So, this is a space where there had been a great deal of women striking, and women workers who were largely young and immigrant were, protesting because they had been locked inside a factory without being able to access outside purposefully, so they couldn't take breaks. And ultimately, as the time goes on, we see this massive fire which takes off in a textile, factory. And a shirtwaist is basically a shirt, just like it's displayed on the screen, a shirt that comes in, at the waist, so you end up with a shirtwaist. And this particular factory goes aflame, and 146 women were killed. And, many people jumped to their deaths. So it has a very public kind of, this happens in New York City, very, very public affair. And there's a great deal of publicity surrounding this. Firefighters come to the aid. There is, people who jump to their death and they go right through the nets, the firefighters had. So a great deal of like backup plans for how to handle, issues like fire. And, just aren't, the government just isn't prepared, to address these kinds of issues. And corporations largely were negligent, in an effort they were negligent. This company, Triangle Factory Fire, was negligent, but really kind of gets off the hook. And so there's a lot of disdain for what corporations were doing. One example of somebody who tries to combat this is Louis Brandeis, who often becomes notable. He's the first Jewish Supreme Court justice, but he becomes very significant Supreme Court justice, and he ultimately does a great deal of reasoning and create some precedent regarding monopolies and reforms of, how to regulate, quote unquote, good trusts versus bad trusts. And this degree of like public regulation of monopolies is really going to accelerate during the time of Woodrow Wilson. Okay. Teddy Roosevelt, we do see become president. He's the first of the progressive presidents. So McKinley's assassinated in 1901. At the time, Teddy Roosevelt's fairly young. He's 42. He's a little bit, of a kind of, not everybody's favorite. We get a sense of him from some of the other things that we studied. But he is somebody who argues in favor of a proposed deal for trusts that should be regulated, that they shouldn't necessarily be destroyed just because they exist. A monopoly exists, so hammer it down. But he does think that bad trusts should be regulated. And an example of this is in 1902. He pursues a massive antitrust suit against a very large railroad trust. And basically, the National Securities Company is broken up by Teddy Roosevelt. He is notable for having a domestic policy called the Square Deal. So we've seen a lot of his foreign policies at home. He's very focused on basically everybody's going to get a square deal. Corporations have interests, and those interests will be considered. But laborers also have interest, and those interests will be considered. So he's a fan of like arbitration, bring me your problem, the other side, bring me your problem, and we'll kind of work it out. So a lot of issues that relate to strikes, Teddy Roosevelt is like directly connected to arbitrating between, a corporation and workers. He does ultimately kind of get credit for the Hepburn Railroad Regulation Act. So he supports this act that Congress does to regulate the railroads. Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. These are acts passed by Congress that are like directly related to the jungle, and that work by Upton Sinclair, and Roosevelt gets attached to this as well. Another thing, and we'll kind of leave it here, that Roosevelt gets very attached to is conservation. Okay, so everything from the national parks, and some of this, is because of his background.